News 24, el único medio en español que te mantiene informado y conectado con la comunidad latina en Israel. News 24, únicamente en i24 News.
Hello and welcome. You're watching i24 News. We're coming to you live from Tel Aviv. Fierce fighting in Jabalia in the north of Gaza and Rafah in the south as political tensions mount following comments by Israel's defence minister. South Africa makes its case to the International Court of Justice in The Hague, calling on it to order the IDF to halt operations in Gaza. And Syria's President Bashar al-Assad among leaders attending the Arab League summit this Thursday in Bahrain. Those are the top stories this hour. Israel has laid to rest 4 out of the 5 soldiers who were killed in a friendly fire incident in Gaza yesterday. 7 others were injured in the incident in Jabalia in the north of the Strip. Our senior correspondent Bianca Zanini has the latest.
While all eyes are on Gaza's southern city of Rafah and an impending Israeli military operation, fighting in the north of the enclave is intensifying. Israeli forces pushing to recapture an area in northern Jabalia, where Hamas had previously been dismantled, facing heavy resistance. Battles are ongoing. Wednesday, Hamas released a video said to show an attack on Israeli soldiers in Gaza City.
As long as Hamas retains control over civilian life in Gaza, it may rebuild and strengthen, thus requiring the IDF to return and fight. In areas where it has already operated, we must dismantle Hamas's governing capabilities in Gaza.
Overnight in the enclave, 5 Israeli soldiers were killed and 8 injured in an accident when Israeli tanks fired shells at a building where the soldiers were stationed. In the south, Israeli forces continue to prepare for an increased incursion in Rafah, believed to be Hamas' last stronghold in Gaza, where both the organization's leaders and Israel's hostages are believed to be held. On IDF orders, about 500,000 Palestinians sheltering in Rafah have fled the area. Recent satellite images show the scale of the movement from the city into so-called humanitarian zones. Issues of safety and access for humanitarian aid to reach the population remain. The U.S. military has now finished installing a floating pier for the Strip and is set to ferry humanitarian aid to the enclave. The UN will receive the aid, and Israeli forces will be in charge of security on the shore. Despite pressure from Washington not to enter Rafah, and despite Israel insisting that it has no other choice if Hamas is to be defeated, the Biden administration is reportedly sending a new package of more than $1 billion in arms and ammunition to Israel.
And this amid, of course, the ongoing political fallout here in Israel following comments by the Defence Minister Yoav Gallant, who's called on Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu to come up for a plan for post-war Gaza. That's led to calls from far-right members of the coalition for Gallant to be sacked. We're here to talk about all of that. In the studio with me this hour, Benjamin Anthony is the CEO of the Miriam Institute. Good to see you, Benjamin. And Ruth Wasserman-Landa is the former member of the Knesset and a former diplomatic envoy in Cairo. Welcome, Ruth. Good to see you, as always, as well. Benjamin, I'll start with you. Let's talk about what is happening inside Gaza, because all of the focus has been on Rafah, but there is fierce fighting as well in Jabalia, which was supposed to have been cleared by the IDF. Clearly, Hamas is still very operational there.
Yeah, there's very fierce fighting going on in Jabalia. We have two divisions there. We've got the 98th Division, the 162nd Division. What's particularly disturbing, a disturbing characteristic of the fighting there now, is that there seems to be a lot of RPG incoming against our armoured corps, against our tanks over there. In actual fact, it's thought that the incoming that the tanks have faced partially caused the friendly fire, the tragic friendly fire incident that resulted in the death of 5 of our soldiers. And I don't think anyone should be surprised about the fact that we're operating again in Jabalia. First of all, we're operating in parts of the city that we haven't operated in before. But secondly, what you're seeing take shape, rightly or wrongly, is a transposing of the plans that we have in Judea and Samaria, which is freedom of security operations in Judea and Samaria since Operation Defensive Shield in 2002, as and when we want to, onto the Gazan map. And we're going to see the IDF enter, exit for many, many years to come. This is the start of that process, as I say, rightly or wrongly.
And on that note, Ruth Wasserman-Land, the Defence Minister, Yoav Gallant, has come out against the Prime Minister, really. He says he will not allow any kind of military occupation of Gaza by the Israelis.
I think that there was a political remark being made, or a statement rather being made, to make sure that sounds coming out of the political coalition do not get picked up by the international arena. In other words, so that the international arena doesn't actually take those remarks seriously, that we plan to go into Gaza militarily and stay in Gaza, or in other words, occupy the Gaza Strip. He made sure that the international arena understands that we are not planning to do that. Perhaps we're not talking about the day after, but militarily we are there for a while, but we intend to come out.
Do you see it as a disagreement, a dispute?
I think it's appalling. I think it's absolutely appalling. I'm not somebody who particularly has a lot of vitriol towards Minister Gallant. He's somebody that I think has acted reasonably well since October the 7th and gave a very clear warning prior to October the 7th about the security threats the State of Israel faced. But when you go to Sheba Hospital and you see the amputees, and when you think about the hundreds of thousands of soldiers who've been drafted, when you think about the hostages being held, the fact that there's an open argument in the Security Cabinet, in the War Cabinet, between the Minister of Defence and the Prime Minister is absolutely reprehensible. Those sorts of conversations need to stay behind closed doors.
All right, let's pick up on that in just a moment. Let's go now to the south of Israel, though, because our correspondent Robert Swift is standing by with the latest on the situation inside Gaza. And Robert, we've been reporting IDF operations in both the north and the south of the Strip today.
Yeah, that's right. They do appear, certainly in the north, to be a slightly calmed tempo as opposed to yesterday. There is ongoing action. There's 2 Apache helicopters in the sky over our heads as we report to you, and there has been attacks taking place in Jabalia, which is behind me. But the tempo of the artillery fire and the airstrikes by the IDF does seem to be slightly reduced as opposed to yesterday. However, inside Jabalia, we have seen reports regarding the ongoing fighting. Hamas has said that its fighters have engaged IDF tanks, and it does appear that the fighting continues. Further south, the IDF have said that they are continuing their operations inside Rafah, pushing further into the city. Comments from Yoav Gallant, the Defence Minister, a little earlier in the day, he suggested that both that the IDF would be reinforcing its presence in Rafah and that it will begin focusing on the tunnels. The tunnels which connect Egypt to the Gaza Strip are a key priority for the IDF to sever, and if they were able to do this successfully, that would seriously reduce the level of resources that Hamas are able to bring into the Gaza Strip, and it would be hoped that that would reduce the ability of Hamas to re-establish itself in areas that the IDF have been in, to prevent Hamas from engaging in a long-term insurgency, which is basically what we can see behind me, because as you have been discussing, the combat taking place behind me in Jabalia is in areas where the IDF have previously conquered.
And Rob, in terms of aid, the United States has been very vocal about the need to get more aid, or what it sees as the need to get more aid into Gaza. They've managed to get a pier up and running that will bring aid in via the sea.
That's right. So this pier, it's understood that it's been anchored in place. It's hoped that that will start bringing in food shortly. The IDF said earlier today that it believes food trucks will be able to be delivered via that crossing in the coming days, they said. Now, this is a project which has been some time in developing, and it's hoped that this will increase the level of food that's able to be brought into the Gaza Strip. Now, at the moment, the worst levels of hunger are understood to be taking place in the north of the Gaza Strip. The IDF in the last few days opened up a new crossing into the north in order to try and deal with that. But it's worth bearing in mind that as this new access point to bring in supplies comes online, there's other access points which have been reduced due to the Rafah operation. The level of food moving into the south of the Gaza Strip is reported to have been decreased, with disruptions both to the Rafah crossing and to the Kerem Shalom crossing. The Rafah crossing in particular, at the minute, Egypt is reportedly refusing to send in food since Israel seized that crossing several days ago.
Rob, thank you very much. Robert Swift there in the south of Israel with the very latest. The Syrian President Bashar al-Assad is among leaders arriving in Bahrain for the Arab League summit this Thursday. Unsurprisingly, the war in Gaza has dominated the meeting, with multiple condemnations of Israel and calls for the creation of a Palestinian state. Our Emmanuel Honora has this report.
Stuck between a rock and a hard place, Bahrain is the latest country to host the Arab summit. The Bahraini king opened the summit in the capital Manama with the promise of hope for the region. He didn't miss the opportunity to call for the creation of a Palestinian state in his speech addressing his regional counterparts. Bahrain has been walking a political tightrope as it tries to balance the public outrage at the war in Gaza with a delicate alliance with Israel as part of the Abraham Accords, which came about in 2020. With all eyes on Saudi Arabia as the country looks to normalize ties with Israel through a U.S. brokered deal, Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman reiterated the country's position on Israel's war in Gaza. Meanwhile, Egyptian President Abdel Fattah el-Sisi slammed Israel over its operation in Rafah.
We found Israel continuing to escape its responsibilities and evade efforts exerted to reach a ceasefire. But instead, it is moving forward in its military operation that is rejected in Rafah, as well as attempting to use Rafah crossing from its Palestinian side to tighten the siege on the enclave.
Notably, Syrian President Bashar al-Assad is also present at the summit, marking the second time the Syrian leader has been reintroduced to the global stage after a decade-long isolation over the Syrian civil war. Saudi Arabia hosted an Arab Islamic summit last November, where a committee of ministers pushed to stop the Israeli war in Gaza and to set up a peace process based on the 1967 borders.
And relations between Israel and Egypt are under increasing strain over the IDF operation in Rafah. Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu has accused Egypt of taking Gazan civilians hostage by refusing to open the Rafah border crossing to refugees. And Cairo has reportedly threatened to downgrade diplomatic ties with Israel if it does not end its operations there. Well, joining us now, Hiba al-Qudsi is the Washington bureau chief at the Saudi newspaper Ashaq al-Awsat. Thank you very much for being with us, Hiba. And first of all, how serious is Cairo about downgrading diplomatic ties with Israel over the operation in Rafah?
It's all because of the Israeli situation invading Rafah without giving any consideration to the Egyptian security fears that has been echoed with some other Western countries, especially the United States. And it's not a matter of Egypt's responsibility. According to the international law, this is a responsibility of the Israelis as an occupation authority. So they have to provide food and all other humanitarian aid to the Palestinians. And they are pushing Egypt to open the borders to receive more refugees from the Palestinian, which is the Israeli responsibility. And on the other hand, the escalation of this going back and forth accusation from the Israeli side and from the Egyptian side, this kind of escalation is very dangerous, especially when it comes to the peace accord. This is there are a lot of anger among the Egyptian people asking President Sisi to do some kind of steps to kick out the Israeli ambassador. This is a real issue for the peace accord that has been there for decades.
Is that public anger more important than Egypt's strategic relationship with Israel that the Foreign Minister Sami Sukri referred to a short while ago?
It's not a matter of either or which one is important. The most important thing is Egyptian security. And Egyptian President Sisi have announced several times and sent several messages that he will not accept anything that will threaten the Egyptian security, especially the Israeli pushing to open the orders and receiving Palestinians in Sinai. This is something that was clearly refused by the Egyptian side and clearly explained that it's the Israeli responsibility. On the other hand, this would be some kind of pushing all the Palestinians to the Egyptian Sinai Peninsula instead of having them or removing them to a secure places inside Gaza.
So Cairo sees the Palestinian civilians as a potential security threat. And I want to ask you about another report, and this is that Egypt has rejected a proposal by the United States to take part in a peacekeeping mission in Gaza alongside troops from the UAE and Morocco. Is that true? Egypt doesn't want anything to do with this?
Actually, the three countries are considering this U.S. proposal to provide troops for an international peacekeeping process in Gaza Strip. Especially, it's very crucial after the destruction that happened in Gaza Strip. But it comes with a cost. It comes with a demand that U.S. will formally recognize a Palestinian state. And this is not only Egyptian and UAE and Morocco stand, but it comes from other Arab countries. There are Arab countries like Saudi Arabia, UAE, Egypt, Jordan. They are willing to provide political and financial support to reconstruct and rebuild Gaza Strip, depending on a path for a Palestinian state. So it's very clear that the Arab states have a clear path about doing everything, about supporting the U.S. proposal, supporting Gaza Strip politically and financially to reassure that Hamas will not regain power there after the war ends. So the Arab states have a clear vision. But the problem is that Israel doesn't have a clear vision of the post-war circumstances. And the U.S. have called several times for Netanyahu to provide this kind of vision. And he still refused. Of course, he refused to negotiate with Hamas, but he also refused to negotiate with Fatah. And he rejected every U.S. call for a two-state solution. So it's all about Israel, not about the Arab states. And for the U.S., it's trying to find a way to lead the efforts to post-war in Gaza, but without having troops on the ground.
Hiba El-Qudsi, thank you very much. We appreciate it. Thank you. Benjamin Anthony and Ruth Wasserman-Land are with me in the studio. Do you think Cairo's serious about severing ties with Israel? A lot of reports coming out now.
There's a lot of disinformation in what I've just heard, and I have a lot of respect for the former speaker. In fact, she's one of the best, in my opinion. But in this particular analysis, I beg to differ. I think that there's a huge misunderstanding, first of all, on the part of Israeli decision makers as per the sensitivity, the Egyptian sensitivity of the whole issue from the beginning. This is extremely sensitive. They've been declaring this, the Egyptians, that there are extremely unhappy about hordes of Palestinians moving from Rafah area into their arena, and knowing the Hamas, knowing how manipulative the Hamas is, seeing the Hamas from their eyes as an enemy, they know that the Hamas will attempt to manipulate the situation in a manner of moving the Palestinian civilians exactly toward that end. And especially now with moving towards the Rafah crossing and putting the Israeli flag, there was a teeny bit of sensitivity that perhaps could have been handled a little bit better by the Israelis. But having said all that, the Americans trying to get Egyptian, Moroccan, and Emirati troops on the ground before Hamas is being destroyed. In other words, the Americans are inviting whom? The Egyptians, the Emiratis, and the Moroccans to be slaughtered by Hamas, or to be the sort of dolls on a string puppeteered by the Hamas to do what the Hamas will tell them to do? Because we had that happen in 2006 with the Fatah, and what had happened was that they were shot in the knees and thrown out of the windows.
Well, they say that they would agree to it now if there was some steps towards a Palestinian state.
Forgive me, I defer to Ruth's expertise dealing with the former panelist, the former contributor. I don't know why that person was platformed to spout that absolute drivel.
Well, she's a serious journalist.
I thought that was
Very
absolutely appalling.
journalist.
I thought it was appalling. I think that was propagandist nonsense. The idea that Israel isn't concerned about the displaced Gazans in the area of Rafah is false. 450 of them, 1,000 of them have been moved out. The Egyptians are culpable for much of what happened on October 7th, and the Egyptians are in breach of international norms by not absorbing the displaced Gazans who were there around the area of Rafah. And finally, there's much to be critical about with regard to Prime Minister Netanyahu, but refusing to cede the ground to the notion of a two-state solution is not one of them. The idea that we would enter into any discussions, serious discussions about a two-state solution ever,
But I mean, to be fair, she was simply saying something similar to what the Israeli defense minister has said, that Israel needs to come up for a plan post-war in Gaza.
No, I thought there was a lot more that she said than what Gallant said. Gallant said that we need to come up with a plan, but she said that Israel hasn't taken into account any of the sensitivities of Egypt when it comes to this, the security of the Sinai Peninsula. I wonder how Egypt would feel if Israel had moved a bunch of its fighters into the Sinai Peninsula to go and attack 1,200 civilians over there. The Egyptians let that happen. It happened on their watch, happened on Sisi's watch. He's culpable, and I don't think that we should excuse this simply based on the fact that this individual is a storied journalist. She's wrong about what she said, and people need to know that she's wrong.
All right, but she's not with us to defend herself, so let's not talk about.
But I'd like
Sure.
to maybe emphasize one issue. It is wrong to say that Israel doesn't care for the security of Egypt, particularly because Israel had allowed Egypt to open the peace accord again and again in the past years, and to enter more soldiers and more military men into the Sinai Peninsula over and above what is permitted in the peace agreement, not only men, but also tools and military equipment. So on the contrary, Israel has given intelligence and permission to the Egyptians to defend themselves. But they could have been a tad more sensitive about maybe coordinating, because there is such a huge sensitivity. However, as I said, the solutions that are raised by the international arena are nonsensical, because it doesn't make sense to leave the Hamas there. And who in their right mind, definitely not the Egyptians, would go in if the Hamas was still there?
Right, okay. Thank you both. Well, South Africa, meanwhile, has launched its fourth case against Israel at the International Court of Justice in The Hague. It accuses Israel of carrying out a genocide in Gaza and is calling for the court to impose emergency measures and order the IDF to end its operations in Rafah and the entire Gaza Strip. Here's one of their representatives making the case earlier today.
Israel is escalating its attacks on Palestinians in Gaza, and in so doing is willfully breaching the binding orders of this court. Israel similarly breaches the binding resolutions of the United Nations Security Council, erroneously believing from the lack of countermeasures by the international community that it is exempt from having to respect international law. This institutionalized impunity has led Israel to engage in this genocide, which has shocked the conscience of humanity.
And Benjamin, we were listening to that this afternoon. Did you hear anything different in the case against Israel today?
You know, I think there are some important points about the case against Israel. Firstly, the urgency with which it's being heard is indicative of a readiness to take a more stringent approach to Israel's operations, particularly inside Rafah, by the ICJ. Secondly, I think that we're not aided by the fact that there is repeated inappropriate rhetoric, including by ministers in this government, about annihilations of peoples, or rhetoric that can be interpreted to call for the annihilation of peoples. That's not helpful. We should have learned the lessons from previous statements prior to the first round at the ICJ. And thirdly, I'm concerned that in the event that the ICJ does move to rule against Israel when it comes to its actions in Rafah, the ICC, which is a court with altogether more teeth, might start to divvy up arrest warrants for Israeli leaders.
If there is a ruling against Israel, could it force it to stop the war against Hamas?
There isn't a serious threat that they would actually send troops to stop Israel, but this is not a good procedure for Israel. It sort of, I think, would have an effect on the ambiance or the atmosphere in the international arena, and it would cause other suits to follow, other kind of negotiations, talks, emergency meetings in the UN and so on, and in international courts and gatherings against Israel. This is not a good indication. The fact that Egypt has joined South Africa in this regard, by the way, who is standing behind all this is Iran. Iran is paying the debts of the ANC and not South African people as such, but the ANC being corrupt, having really completely corrupted a country with huge resources, has sold its soul to the Iranians. And the fact that the Egyptians have actually joined this issue is really to show, to indicate, we've had enough. This is really the red line. We are truly concerned about what is happening now. Intimate discussions would probably help to lower the concerns, the Egyptian concerns, but I'm talking about the highest possible level, not in the media, but face to face.
And of course, it could come down to the Security Council, and depending on a US veto. We know the US withheld that veto once before.
Well, let's hope that it will happen again.
Okay. Ruth, Benjamin, for now, thank you very much. We're going to take a very short break. When we come back, fighting has intensified in the north of Israel, with Hezbollah firing barrels of rockets at the Golan and the Galilee regions this Thursday. More on that next.
Esta semana en News 24, Israel bajo ataque. News 24 en español trae el análisis y la información de los acontecimientos de la guerra Espadas de Hierro.
Entrevistas exclusivas, reportes desde la zona de guerra, la reacción de los países hispanoparlantes.
News 24, el único medio en español que te mantiene informado y conectado con la comunidad latina en Israel. News 24 únicamente en I24 News.
Welcome back. Violence is escalating on the northern border between Israel and Lebanon. Israeli fighter jets struck a Hezbollah rocket launching position in southern Lebanon that was used to fire some 40 rockets at the Golan Heights this morning. The Lebanese terrorist group says the cross-border attacks are its response to last night's Israeli strikes deep inside Lebanese territory. More in this report.
A daily sound in Israel's north, and a daily occurrence. Hezbollah intensifying its attacks, and the IDF upping its response. Israeli jets launched overnight what Lebanese media claimed was their largest attack on Baalbek, a Hezbollah stronghold 60 miles from the border. By Thursday morning, Hezbollah had retaliated by sending over 40 rockets and anti-tank missiles at Israel. The Israeli strike came after a drone packed with explosives sent by the Lebanese terror group hit a sensitive IDF facility 21 miles from the border. It was the furthest Hezbollah drones had penetrated Israel since the Iranian-backed group began firing projectiles in wake of Hamas's brutal attack on October the 7th.
The link between the supportive Lebanese front and Gaza is definitive, final, and conclusive.
On Tuesday night, Israel had killed a senior Hezbollah operative in the Lebanese city of Tyre, who joins a long list of Hezbollah leaders Israel has targeted since the fighting broke out. That attack came after one civilian was killed and several IDF soldiers injured along the border. Although the cross-border tit-for-tat fighting has failed to flare up into an all-out war, analysts predict that it is only a matter of time until it does.
Well, there was a further barrage of rockets fired at the Galilee region earlier today. Let's get the latest on the situation in the north now. We're joined by our correspondent, Balir Sladi. Balir's in Haifa. Balir, what's been going on this afternoon?
Yeah, so just a few words about what happened here in Haifa. A few minutes ago, the protest ended, and about 100 people participated in this protest of the people that were forced to evacuate on October 8th, or during October, actually, because of the exchange of fire between Israel and Hezbollah. The people here behind me has been holding signs saying that they're demanding security, and they're demanding that Israel takes action against Hezbollah so they can go back home safely to their villages and towns that are close to the border. What they have been saying that they don't want to be Be'eri 2.0, so like the second Be'eri, the town that is close to Gaza, where more than 100 people were killed during the October 7th attack. So they don't want to. They are afraid actually of a scenario where the elite unit of Hezbollah, the Radwan unit, would actually penetrate inside Israel and do the same to them. The people in Shlomi, in many other areas, in Shtula, in Zer'it, or many towns that are very close to the border. And by the way, this is happening while the people in Shlomi here protesting. In parallel with that, one rocket at least has actually been actually fall in open terrain beside Shlomi. It demonstrates the situation here where there is absolutely something that Israel cannot accept. These people cannot accept, and they're demanding action against Hezbollah, especially during this day. And I want to add in the report that you have just showed, more than 200 rockets actually were fired from Lebanon. It's not only about the quantity, it's also about the quality. We're talking about a new weapon that Hezbollah has actually revealed today, a weapon that is actually a drone that fires a missile. They call it an S-5 missile. They used it in Metula. In that incident specifically, one soldier was seriously wounded and two others were lightly wounded. wounded. So it is effective from the point of view of Hezbollah, of course. And once again, this is happening after, during the beginning of this week, they have also announced that they are using new missiles. They are calling them the Maghniye missiles. So Hezbollah is using more and more weaponry, very complicated weaponry that apparently the Israeli defense system is not being able to deal with, and we've seen that during the attack where 2 drones were fired. One was intercepted, the other one hit 40 kilometers away target inside a strategic and a very sensitive location, military location in Golani Junction inside Israel. So again, the situation is unbearable, and the demonstrators here behind me showed that today, and they're demanding action from Israel.
Balir, thank you very much. Balir Sladin there. Well, for more on the situation in the north, we're joined by Major Shadi Khalloul, former security zone officer in South Lebanon and Hezbollah expert, and former security expert as well. Thanks for being with us. Shadi, the situation appears to go from bad to worse in the north. We're hearing Hezbollah using more sophisticated weapons more than 7 months into this war. I mean, how can we imagine that Israeli citizens will be able to go back to their homes in the north?
Well, first of all, as you mentioned, Laura, I am here in the north and I see this escalation in daily basis. We have seen that in the last few days, Hezbollah escalated the situation by firing massive rocket attacks in Mount Meron region and deep inside Israel, 45 kilometers deep in Golani Junction, which hitting a very sensitive military equipment, and as well as hitting a massive rocket attacks in Western Galilee and Eastern Galilee, Kiryat Shmona region. This escalation comes actually after an announcement of Upper Galilee mayor, actually regional authority mayor, councilman, and he mentioned clearly that calling the people to come back to their homes. In the same day, he said that Hezbollah attacked Kiryat Shmona with massive rocket attack, and this area actually just to show people that you cannot trust your actually leaders. We are the ones who decide when you will be back, and if you want to get back to your homes, you need to pressure your government, stop the aggression, as they call it, in their side in Gaza. So Hezbollah is trying to show that he's the one who here decide when the citizens will be back to their homes, and it's up to the Israeli government to listen to what Hezbollah wants. So I don't see now that Hezbollah will de-escalate. The opposite, we are going to escalate further the situation in the north. That's what we are saying that Hezbollah doing, and that's why I don't see and don't anticipate the return of the citizens home.
And we've got a clear sign of cooperation, haven't we, between Hamas and Hezbollah? We saw the two groups meeting today in Beirut.
Well, yeah, they met today in Beirut, and they try also to organize themselves again, because Hezbollah is, as you know, is the one who orchestrated all this attack in the south as well, and it was well designed in Beirut by the foreign minister of Iran with the Secretary General Hassan Nasrallah, Ziad al-Aruri, and Ziad Nakhali and Saleh al-Aruri, who was assassinated by Israel later on after the October 7 attack. So this meeting, specific meeting, it was also a message to Europe after his last speech, Hassan Nasrallah last speech, calling all immigrants, Sunni immigrants, 2 million immigrants in Lebanon, to migrate to Europe, opening the sea for them, sending them to Cyprus, which is part of the European Union, and from there to the European continent. This is a main threat to the Europeans, actually, to call them, actually, if you don't play the games as we want, then we will send you those immigrants to and for that reason you need to support us and support our plans in the region and pressure also Israel, and at the same time they are helping Assad to get rid of a large Sunni population, re-inhabiting Syria with a Shia Pakistani and Afghanis, that bringing them to Syria and re-inhabiting them in homes in Aleppo and in Damascus. And we saw already neighbors in Damascus, for example, is entirely changed with, instead of Sunni population, it's full inhabited.
It's a lot of strings that the Islamic Republic is pulling in the region. Shadi, we'll leave it there. Thank you very much indeed, Shadi Khalloul.
Thank you.
And Benjamin, just to go back, we're in a bit of a deadly stalemate, really, that's been going on for more than 7 months now. I mean, what is the next step? How can we get out of this?
Look, at the risk of repeating myself, I felt very strongly that after October the 7th, we should have stayed our hand in Gaza. We should have, once Hezbollah started to fire on us, we should have turned our attention there, severely downgraded their munitions capabilities. We didn't do that. And now we seem to have effectively ceded the north. There are about 60,000 of our civilians who are refugees in their own homes. By the way, what's going on with regard to Hezbollah harkens back to an earlier segment when you talk about an international force, or when one does, about the UAE, the Moroccans and the Egyptians going and keeping the peace over inside Gaza. I was a soldier there on the border prior to the war of 2006, and then shortly thereafter I was a soldier inside southern Lebanon in 2006. And I can tell you that prior to the hot war beginning, I looked out from my position and could clearly see international forces there sitting down, cavorting with members of Hezbollah, and then once the firing began, abandoning the area. You cannot have an international peacekeeping force with no particular heart and soul in the fight, policing anywhere on Israel's borders, and we cannot have a situation where Israel outsources its security to these international forces. You want proof of that? Look at what's going on in southern Lebanon right now. The same will be the case in the event that the UAE, Moroccans and the Egyptians move into Gaza, which, by the way, they won't.
Okay, Ruth.
I happen to agree. International forces, in such a sensitive situation won't do the job. They didn't do it in the north. Very unlikely that they do it in the south. But even more so, as I had said, there's a problem with Hamas, and there's Hamas also in Lebanon. By the way, the Shiites, backed by Iran, are not only moving or encouraging, let's say in inverted commas, the Sunnis to come out and look for homes in Europe, but they're also doing it to the Druze. And this is going very, very quietly, completely off the radar. They are, for the very first time, invading Jabal Druze in Syria. This is a very serious issue, causing the Druze to come into the fighting for the very first time. They were on the fence.
To turn against Assad.
Exactly. And this is something that one should watch for as well.
Absolutely. Okay, thank you both. Well, as global attention shifts to Gaza amid the ongoing operation in Rafah, the leader of Yemen's Houthis has threatened to target any ships heading for Israeli ports, including those outside of the Red Sea. For more on that, we're joined by expert on Iran, Yemen and radical movements, Catherine Perez-Shakdan. Good to see you, Catherine. Houthi attacks non-stop since the start of the conflict, but the Houthis have managed to even target Iranian ships. What is changing in their strategy here?
Well, I don't know. I think the Houthis are just targeting anyone who's moving in the Red Sea, and I think definitely mistakes were made. But essentially what they're trying to do is to make it so costly for Western capitals to back Israel. They're trying to create a situation where it would be too problematic for Western capitals to back Israel, that out of fear for their own ability to move freely in the Red Sea, and therefore one of the main world oil routes, and to enable trade to continue to flow and for the economy to prosper, they want the West to bow to the will of the Islamic Republic of Iran, and create a situation of anxiety and threat and chaos. Unfortunately, the West is not reacting the way it should. I think that the West is literally under occupation immediately in terms of the economy, the way that they're being attacked, the belligerence coming out of Iranian proxies. And I would argue that there's a very strong it's not so covert anymore, effort to colonize the West, and I would say the Middle East. And no one seems to be too mindful about it. No one is calling it out. And I can't quite understand the why. When you have the state of Israel that is literally surrounded by enemies, from Hezbollah to Hamas to Syria, and of course the Houthis, that all of them are part of this Shia crescent that is dominated by the Islamic Republic. Clearly, there's an issue. And I think that the West is forgetting that it stands in the same situation exactly. That it doesn't understand that it stands like Israel under occupation and about to be colonized and the enemies within.
And the focus in the region, of course, is very much on Gaza, on creating a Palestinian state. And Yemen has actually sent a delegation to the Arab League summit in Bahrain. They're not talking about the Houthis or the fact this terrorist group has taken over most of their country.
Look, I think the issue is this. I think that for some reason, the Palestinians have been very successful at doing one thing, with the help, of course, of Tehran, is to convince the Arab world that, number one, in order to be a good Muslim, you have to be pro-Palestinian, and that means being anti-Israeli or anti-Semite. And naturally, this comes easily to them. They had centuries of practice of anti-Semitism, so it's very easy for them to do so. The biggest problem is this. I do believe that Arab leaders understand exactly what is going on. The problem is the second they have to admit to it and admit that Israel is not the enemy, that actually Israel might be the solution, they would have to face a reality that is very uncomfortable. How would they tell their population that they actually have lost control of geopolitics, of their own sovereignty, that they are being invaded by Iranian proxies, that they are being invaded by the RSGC, that everything that is going on in their country, from the social norms to the political to the economic interests, are actually dictated by Tehran covertly? They will have to, it's putting their leadership in jeopardy. And I think that they're trying to run away from the problem, trying to pin it on Israel, saying that once we deal with that, once there's a state for the Palestinians, everything will be sorted. What they don't understand is that if they actually want to liberate Palestinians, they're going to have to start with Hamas. Lebanon would need to be liberated from Hezbollah, which is an occupying force and a colonizing force directed by Iran. And the same thing is being replicated from Yemen to Iraq to Syria. So rather than talk about Gaza, which is literally not the problem, not really in the Middle East, other than the fact that we need our hostages back, and that I think is a legitimate demand, we need to make sure that Palestinians don't suffer under Hamas. We need to make sure that Lebanese don't suffer under Hezbollah. The Syrians deserve their freedom, the same with the Yemenis and the Iraqis. So maybe time to stop talking about Israel and talk about the colonialism that is coming out of the Islamic Republic of Iran, and actually talk about the real elephant in the room.
Catherine, thank you very much. Catherine Perez-Shakdam there. And Catherine makes a good point, doesn't she? There's a lot going on in the region, not least Yemen being taken over by a terrorist group, which is causing chaos in the region. And all they're talking about in Manama this week is Gaza.
It's not Manama that worries me, because the Arab League has always been a kind of an arena where many superlatives were used, and everybody is a brother of everybody else. And we all know that there's a bit of a difference between that and reality in the Arab world. It's not homogenous in any way. However, what worries me is the West and the blindness that I feel, and the former speaker had mentioned it. There is zero awareness that this is seeping into the schools. I'm not even talking about the campuses, but the actual schools with the syllabus that small kids are studying about Marxism in a capitalist country like in the US. There's a premeditated, obvious, kind of a systematic,
well-funded as well,
well-funded campaign to literally destroy Western democracies.
Well, Turkey's President Erdogan remains one of Israel's fiercest critics over the war in Gaza. After calling a halt to all trade with Israel earlier this month, he's now warning that Israel may seek to invade Turkey. He's also said that Hamas terrorists are being treated in Turkish hospitals, and there are reports that Hamas has for many years now sought to establish bases and cells inside Turkey. Dr. Sinan Sidi is a senior fellow on Turkey at the Foundation for the Defence of Democracies. Thank you for being with us. Just when you think Erdogan's claims about Israel couldn't get any more outlandish, he's actually accused Israel of trying to invade Turkey, the country with the second biggest army in NATO.
Yes, I mean, at this point, we're always shocked but not surprised, right? Because we're never actually sure what he's actually going to say. And even I was surprised by this one. I was actually thrown aback yesterday when I heard these comments. And he really did sort of make this sort of argument suggesting that, Hamas was the first line of defense against an impending or an eventual Israeli invasion of the Turkish heartland. And it really is intended for domestic consumption, basically to rally around his political base, because he was so discredited recently at the local elections for seeming to be anti-Israel in Turkey and supporting Hamas. But, in actual fact, he's been continuing to essentially, carry out trade with Israel, whilst his critics were saying, well, how can you have both? You can't trade with Israel on the one hand if you accuse it being, quote unquote, a genocidal state.
Where does public opinion stand inside Turkey? I know it's difficult to gauge, but when it comes to Erdogan's, really die-hard support for Hamas and Islamism, where does your average Turk stand on that issue?
I think it's fair to say, look, Turkey is a Muslim majority country. Over 99% of its population are Muslim, and historically they have, sympathies for Palestinians in general. But with Hamas, I would say this is a new frontier because it's elite-driven by Erdogan and the Erdogan media machine. It is essentially, nonstop. It's night and day. They've organized pro-Palestine, pro-Hamas rallies in Istanbul, even one on New Year's Day. Material support, sanctuary, provision of passports to people like Ismail Haniyeh and Salih al-Aruri before he's assassinated. Discussions of possibly relocating the headquarters of Hamas from Qatar to Turkey. All of this gets essentially publicized, right? So the average Turk is essentially very sort of, I would say, pro-Hamas at this point. But you have, people say, well, we shouldn't be surprised because Turkey is a Muslim majority country. There are a lot of regional countries in the area which also espouse sort of pro-Hamas views. And I said, yes, that's true. We shouldn't be necessarily surprised at that. But I would also reply, how many of those countries are members of NATO? How many of those countries are aspiring members of the European Union, right? Or members of every single Western security institution since, the beginning of the Cold War, which Turkey clearly is. So it's a clear outlier, and nobody's essentially questioning it here in Washington or Europe.
Yeah, of course. And prior to Erdogan coming to power, there was some serious talk about Turkey joining the European Union. That seems to have been put to bed forever. Is there any pushback at all from the United States? As you rightly point out, NATO is a NATO member. It is an ally of the United States.
Very little. Unfortunately, what we see is this sort of pathological fear on behalf of, the State Department as well as other U.S. authorities, right? Pathological fear of losing Turkey, quote unquote, in a similar vein to how they lost Iran back in 1979. The fear is that if they push Turkey hard and hold it to account for supporting terrorist entities like Hamas, but also, being quite wayward in its approach to, helping Ukraine against Russian invasion, right? There's very little sort of appetite for holding Turkey to account because they fear that if they do hold it to account with sanctions or really admonishing the Turkish president, right, then they fear that relations and ties will completely snap and Turkey under Erdogan will go completely the way of like Russia and China and the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, cut ties with its Western sort of anchor. I think it's misguided. But obviously, the only thing that I've seen, to sort of, hold Turkey to account is it looks like the Biden administration really just recently canceled a visit to the White House by Erdogan after, Erdogan cut ties with Israel trade-wise and hosted Ismail Haniyeh in Istanbul. Those are sort of, I would say, sort of piecemeal measures. Congress has a tougher line on Turkey, I think, somewhat, or used to. In terms of, denying weapon sales to Turkey. But even that has been surpassed with a $23 billion deal to sell fighter jets to Turkey. And the only other sort of institution which is really holding, if it's doing as much as it can, is the U.S. Treasury Department, which has, increased its number of sanctions against persons affiliated with or, advocating for, conducting Hamas business inside of Turkey.
And just a word on what's happening inside Turkey. The Kurdish leader, a popular politician, Selahattin Demirtas, he's just been jailed for 20 years. Can you tell us a bit about that?
Well, I mean, he's been in jail since actually, what's slightly misleading about, Demirtas' position is he's actually been in jail since 2016. I mean, he really hasn't been able to get out. And he's significant because as one of the co-leaders of the Kurdish democratic movement inside of Turkey, he was quite a popular figure. And one of the main reasons he was, jailed was essentially, in the 2016, 2017 sort of campaigns. in Turkey for the political campaign, he basically said, we are not going to make you President Erdogan, right? We're not going to help you. And he was very defiant towards Erdogan. And his popularity amongst Kurdish voters, as well as liberal voters in Turkey, right, who gravitated towards him, Erdogan feared that he was going to take votes away from him. So he's jailed him. The reason why they're upholding that sentence with another 20-year sentence is really sort of ratchet up this sort of increasing authoritarianism, I would argue, at home, right? They're really clamping down and wanting to ensure that any form of political dissidence inside of Turkey following a heavy defeat at the local polls, they want to try and keep tabs on any sort of area where sort of an anti-Erdogan vote or a charismatic leader may essentially sort of rise up against and challenge him down the road.
Dr. Sidi at the FDD, thank you very much.
Thanks for having me.
And Benjamin, I mean, just before we go, it's a theme that has persisted over many years, hasn't it? There are many conflicts, there are many human rights abuses in this part of the world, sadly. The complete focus is on Israel's war against an Islamist terrorist group.
Yeah, I'm just listening to that guest and hearkening back again to when Barack Obama finished his second visit to Israel and implored Bibi Netanyahu to apologize to Erdogan. The viewers might remember that.
I don't remember.
Didn't really serve us particularly well, but that's an aside. The situation is that there is, again, a double standard being applied to the Jewish state, both in terms of the prominence that it has in the international media, and there seems to be an open call for it to do the impossible. America calls for Israel to sort out the day after, as the Americans failed to do, for example, the day after they were in Afghanistan. The Americans are, in the ICJ, we have people making accusations that there are 1 million people still in the area of Rafah. 450,000 of them have moved already. This is something that's replete. It's not going to go anywhere. And I think that the most important thing is that we strengthen the state of Israel, keep fighting, and achieve our war goals. We shouldn't forget those. Go and destroy Hamas militarily, prevent it from reforming, and bring our hostages home. Until those two objectives are achieved, we can't really talk about the day after, in my opinion.
All right, Benjamin Anthony and Ruth Wasserman-Landau, thank you both very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And that brings us to the end of tonight's show. Do stay with us on I24 News. Benita Levin is up next.
Tel Aviv is ranked the happiest city in the world and the best place to own a home. For 3 generations, the Ben Shalom family has built boutique apartment buildings in the most desirable locations. From restoration in historical locales to homes along Park HaYarkon, Ben Shalom is a one-stop shop from start to finish and friends for life.
Esta semana en News 24, Israel bajo ataque. News 24 en español trae el análisis y la información de los acontecimientos de la guerra, Espadas de Hierro.
Entrevistas exclusivas, reportes desde la zona de guerra, la reacción de los países hispanoparlantes.
News 24, el único medio en español que te mantiene informado y conectado con la comunidad latina en Israel. News 24, únicamente en I24 News.
This is Breaking News Edition. I'm Benisa Levine. A tragic development inside northern Gaza overnight, in which an IDF tank team fired 2 shells at a building believing terrorists were inside. Israeli troops were in that building. 5 Israeli soldiers were killed and another 7 wounded due to the so-called friendly fire in Jabalia on Wednesday evening. The soldiers all served in the Paratroopers Brigade's 202nd Battalion. Investigations are underway into how this happened. It brings the Israeli death toll in the retaliatory ground operation over the past 7 months to 278. A civilian contractor from the Defense Ministry was also killed in the Gaza Strip. He was due to get married in 2 weeks' time. Day 223 of the war. No ceasefire deal, no hostage deal. The fighting inside Gaza continues, and Israel is adamant it has to conduct a full incursion into Rafah in southern Gaza to eliminate the Hamas threat. Senior correspondent Bianca Zanini has more in this report.
While all eyes are on Gaza's southern city of Rafah and an impending Israeli military operation, fighting in the north of the enclave is intensifying. Israeli forces pushing to recapture an area in northern Jabalia, where Hamas had previously been dismantled, facing heavy resistance. Battles are ongoing. Wednesday, Hamas released a video said to show an attack on Israeli soldiers in Gaza City.
As long as Hamas retains control over civilian life in Gaza, it may rebuild and strengthen, thus requiring the IDF to return and fight. In areas where it has already operated, we must dismantle Hamas's governing capabilities in Gaza.
Overnight in the enclave, 5 Israeli soldiers were killed and 8 injured in an accident when Israeli tanks fired shells at a building where the soldiers were stationed. In the south, Israeli forces continue to prepare for an increased incursion in Rafah, believed to be Hamas' last stronghold in Gaza, where both the organization's leaders and Israel's hostages are believed to be held. On IDF orders, about 500,000 Palestinians sheltering in Rafah have fled the area. Recent satellite images show the scale of the movement from the city into so-called humanitarian zones. Issues of safety and access for humanitarian aid to reach the population remain. The U.S. military has now finished installing a floating pier for the Strip and is set to ferry humanitarian aid to the enclave. The UN will receive the aid, and Israeli forces will be in charge of security on the shore. Despite pressure from Washington not to enter Rafah, and despite Israel insisting that it has no other choice if Hamas is to be defeated, the Biden administration is reportedly sending a new package of more than $1 billion in arms and ammunition to Israel.
So for more reaction and insight, we welcome to studio Brigadier General in the Reserves, Israel Shafir, former commander at the Tel Nof Air Force Base and a former combat pilot in the Israeli Air Force, and Danny Ayalon, former Israeli ambassador to the US, the former Israeli deputy foreign minister and the chairman of Silver Road Capital. Gentlemen, thank you both so much for being here in studio. A heavy heart for the whole nation right now. Ambassador, I'm going to start with you. This so-called friendly fire in northern Gaza, a massive cost, devastating for the nation.
Oh, absolutely. And this is something that is unavoidable, unfortunately. In every war, any fighting force, experience this friendly fire. It's really heartbreaking. But as much as you train against it and as much as you are trying to be careful, things like that happen, especially in an area which is so congested, where could be combats almost of a hand-to-hand almost, or face-to-face. This is something that unfortunately cannot be avoidable, but I'm sure that lessons will be learned, and as much as possible it will be taught throughout the forces combating in Gaza.
The focus has been on the pending major incursion into Rafah, but this happening in northern Gaza, and we keep on hearing about Hamas's ability to regroup there. Very concerning. Your thoughts?
Concerning but expected. And it will recur again and again as long as we pull out and let the locals manage themselves, Hamas are going to manage them, because Hamas are changing their clothing from warriors to civilians or police, and policing the streets and policing the food and the incoming aid. So as far as that's concerned, they can switch immediately with weapon caches that they've left behind. Not big ones, Kalashnikovs, small mortars and things of that nature, and be a threat to our soldiers when they return. And in this particular case, a mishap like this, which was very unfortunate, but about 10% in this particular war of our casualties are friendly fire types. Usually in wars, the numbers are closer to 20%. So 10% is something that is almost unavoidable, because you have to react very quickly, either shoot or be shot. And if you don't know exactly where the other forces are, then these things happen. So it's unfortunate, but we should brace ourselves. This is what war looks like.
Certainly devastating. As you say, this is unfortunately, tragically part of a war. Gentlemen, stay with us. We've got much more to discuss, but right now let's find out what is happening on the ground. We go live to correspondent Robert Swift. He joins us from southern Israel. And Rob, we know Yoav Gallant says more troops will be sent to Rafah, the Israeli defense minister making it clear this operation will intensify. What is the latest out of Gaza? What can you tell us?
That's right. The defence minister also saying that the focus of the IDF operation would need to be the tunnels which cut across the border, connecting the Gaza Strip to Egypt, and an important source of incoming resources for Hamas. With regards to updates from the Gaza Strip, the most recent incident to have taken place is yet another launch of a rocket or a mortar attack against the Kerem Shalom crossing. This taking place about 20 minutes ago. Now, this is the second such attack of this nature against the Kerem Shalom crossing. And it's the fourth incident of indirect fire like this today. There was one other community just close to the Gaza-Israel border was targeted earlier today, and there was also an incident of rockets landing a few hundred meters from our position without the siren going off. Now, there has been an increase in these sorts of attacks in the last week, I guess I would say. An increase of rocket fire, mortar fire, as the level of combat taking place inside the Gaza Strip has increased. It does appear that Hamas have responded with these sorts of attacks.
And Rob, perhaps you could unpack in a little bit of detail the significance of rockets or mortars being sent right now from the Gaza Strip to Kerem Shalom. That is a crossing which is supposed to be the route with which aid is getting through to the Palestinian enclave, an issue which was dealt with even at The Hague in recent hours.
Right, indeed. So first of all, from Hamas's point of view, they have seen some success. They have caused fatalities to the IDF when targeting Kerem Shalom or the IDF positions around it. So they know it's a target that they can hit, and that makes it tempting for them. Secondly, Hamas knows that if they force Israel to close this crossing, then that will bring diplomatic pressure upon Israel. Israel is already within tensions with many of its allies and other parts of the international community due to the lack of supplies getting into the Gaza Strip. If Hamas can add to this pressure, then it's only to their benefit. And finally, these sorts of attacks, they're easy for Hamas to do. To set up a mortar position, to set up rockets and launch them, it's an easy way for them to make an attack, an indirect one, which the IDF is not always able to respond to. Hamas footage, propaganda videos that they've released today has shown a lot of these mortars being launched. And that seems to imply that they, for now at least, think that this is an effective way for them to confront the IDF without going directly head-to-head with them.
At the same time, the pressure is on Israel to make sure that Palestinian civilians in Rafah get to safety, get to shelter. Talk us through that process right now.
Right, so this is the nature of Hamas being able to hide among a city, hide among the civilian population. With regards to protecting that civilian population, additional efforts are being made to bring in more food to the Gaza Strip. With the US-built pontoon pier, it's understood that has been connected in the last 24 hours to the beach, and the IDF have said earlier today that they believe food aid will start being delivered through that access point in the coming days. Now, this is a joint US-Israeli-run process. The IDF will not be operating the pier, but will be providing security on the ground. And through that access point, it's hoped that food will be able to be brought in from the sea to reduce the level of hunger which is being seen here in the north of the Gaza Strip, which it's understood from international organizations conducting humanitarian efforts there that is where the most severe hunger is felt. But also, increasingly, the south of the Gaza Strip, due to the disruptions being caused to the Kerem Shalom crossing and the Rafah crossing into Egypt, as Israel has launched the operation into Rafah, the food scarcity is becoming an issue there. So it's hoped that this additional access point will be able to balance out some of that food requirement.
Thank you so much. Correspondent Robert Swift updating us from southern Israel. Thank you, Rob. And still in studio, our panel, Brigadier General in the Reserves, Israel Relic Shafir. Your thoughts on exactly that? So much pressure for the humanitarian aid to get through into Gaza. At the same time, rocket fire coming towards Kerem Shalom once again.
Well, this is the complexity of the situation in Gaza, in that we're fighting Hamas. We're not fighting the Palestinians in Gaza. They may not be Zionists or may not like us, but we're not fighting those people. So in actually taking over Gaza, we have actually taken over also the care for the Palestinians. And the absurd situation is Hamas is fighting and we are helping the Palestinians.
I'm going to stop you right there because the US State Department is tackling the issue of Rafah as we speak. Let's take a listen.
This is not a border crossing, specifically the Rafah one. It is not one that the United States controls, but we are actively engaged with the relevant authorities to advocate for their safe departure from Gaza. We're continuing to have those conversations. We're in direct touch with these doctors and the group that they are a part of, as well as their families.
I just want to repose this question, given your exchange just now with Daphne. I mean, it was a few days after the World Central Kitchen strike on April 1st that both the president and the secretary have said that a change in U.S. policy would come if Israel didn't improve the humanitarian aid front. So it's a month and a half later. Are there any consequences being thought about, considered by the administration, specifically in response to the humanitarian aid problem?
Well, Olivia, I think it's important to remember, and you were here when Ambassador Satterfield came to this briefing. Actually, I'm not sure you were here.
Not here.
You were not here. You were in Capri having a blast with the rest of the bullpen. When Ambassador Satterfield was here, he spoke about the progress that we did see in that time period when it came to sustained humanitarian assistance. There, of course, has been a bit of a regression, given in large part due to some of the kinetic activity that we've seen around Kerem Shalom, kinetic activity that we've seen around the Rafah border crossing. And that is understandable. But simultaneously, we continue to press and engage directly with the Egyptians, with the Israelis, that we need to do everything we can to turn these border crossings on so that more sustained humanitarian aid can get into Gaza. And should we not see sustained progress, the president and the secretary were quite clear, and that that statement continues to ring true.
Okay. I mean, just underscoring the fact that it was a month and a half ago. I understand there was some progress, but
there was progress. There was progress, and again, it is largely because of kinetic activity from Hamas. In fact, we have seen some of these border crossings unfortunately close, and we are working around the clock with our partners in Israel, with our partners in Egypt, as it relates to the Rafah one especially, to do everything we can to turn those back on.
There's no timeline or deadline that you're working with.
There was not a timeline or a deadline when we spoke about this at the beginning of April. This is a frank and direct. This is a frank and direct conversation that we'll continue to have with our partners in Israel, and we want to continue to see immediate and sustained flow. I obviously was able to provide some metrics here. We are seeing some positive steps in the right direction. The cooperation from a number of regional partners as it relates to the maritime corridor will, of course, be a positive step in the right direction. We want to continue to see more, and we intend to raise that if we don't.
Tangential but related, because the President and Secretary also stressed the importance of establishing a better deconfliction mechanism.
The U.S. State Department's Vedant Patel taking questions there on the very topic we've been talking about here in studio. So I'm going to come back to you, Relic, to pick up where you left off, and an issue that's being discussed right now by the U.S. State Department.
Well, you know, when we go in, it's a package deal. We fight Hamas, we feed the Palestinians, and maybe provide a hope or a future together with moderate Arab countries and the United States. Our internal political problem is that some of the ministers in the government and the Prime Minister himself don't want to speak about the day after and are brushing this aside as if something magical will happen if we don't do anything. Whereas other people, namely Defense Minister Gallant, who sees that if we go in, we will be in the mire, so to speak, and he wants to start working on alternative to Israelis running Gaza with all its problems, and take steps in order to do this, while ministers on the extreme right are actually telling the people that they want to settle in Gaza and have the Palestinians migrate somewhere. So it's a mesh of problems that Israeli leadership is not able to cope with, and this puts us more in deeper and deeper into the mire.
We are going to take a deeper look at the day after, and of course the internal conflict exacerbating the situation. Indeed, stay with us, gentlemen. More to discuss right now. We're turning to the northern front. 3 Israeli soldiers have been wounded after an explosive-laden drone launched from Lebanon crashed and exploded in an area near the community of Metula. One of the troops is in serious condition. The IDF says it is investigating the incident. Hezbollah claiming that the drone was armed with missiles that were launched at IDF targets, the latest in a spate of incidents across the border between Israel and Lebanon, including one on Wednesday in which a Hezbollah drone hit a sensitive military site. More in this I-24 News report.
A daily sound in Israel's north, and a daily occurrence. Hezbollah intensifying its attacks, and the IDF upping its response. Israeli jets launched overnight what Lebanese media claimed was their largest attack on Baalbek, a Hezbollah stronghold 60 miles from the border. By Thursday morning, Hezbollah had retaliated by sending over 40 rockets and anti-tank missiles at Israel. The Israeli strike came after a drone packed with explosives sent by the Lebanese terror group hit a sensitive IDF facility 21 miles from the border. It was the furthest Hezbollah drones had penetrated Israel since the Iranian-backed group began firing projectiles in wake of Hamas's brutal attack on October the 7th.
The link between the supportive Lebanese front and Gaza is definitive, final, and conclusive.
On Tuesday night, Israel had killed a senior Hezbollah operative in the Lebanese city of Tyre, who joins a long list of Hezbollah leaders Israel has targeted since the fighting broke out. That attack came after one civilian was killed and several IDF soldiers injured along the border. Although the cross-border tit-for-tat fighting has failed to flare up into an all-out war, analysts predict that it is only a matter of time until it does.
So for the latest developments, let's go live to correspondent Balir Sladin. He joins us from northern Israel. And Balir, rocket sirens again in Rosh Hashanah, Shlomi and other northern communities in recent hours. So much across that northern front. Update us. What can you tell us?
Yes, 12 times Hezbollah until now took responsibility for actions against the Israeli northern communities, and we're seeing an obvious escalation from Hezbollah's side. We're not talking only about the quantity that actually more than 200 rockets were fired today toward the Israeli north, but also the quality, because Hezbollah today is revealing a new weapon. I'm not sure whether the Israeli side were known of this or aware of this a new weapon. We're talking about a drone that fires a missile. They're calling it S-5 missile. Apparently, it's an unguided missile, 5 kilograms in weight, and could also reach a very large range that can, of course, be dangerous for the Israeli soldiers. And in general, Hezbollah can use this very strategically against very sensitive sites in Israeli north, and even more far than this. We've seen that also yesterday, not using that specific drone, but actually 2 drones were fired. One of them reached a target which is 50 kilometers away from the Lebanese-Israeli border. So Hezbollah is not only responding with quantity, but also with quality of new weaponry, quality of new targets. The last one was actually a firm or like a storage, it could be, from what I could understand from the Hezbollah announcement, in Tal Hai. So they are also targeting where Israel is developing new weapons, where Israel is storing new weapons. So this is, of course, something that the Israelis cannot accept. We've heard the Israeli chief of staff today coming back from the north, and he said that he sensed a lot of readiness from the Israeli military. But if we are listening carefully to what the Israelis that evacuated from the north are saying, they are saying that all of this is not acceptable. We can't take any more words. We want actions. We've been actually today with some of the protests that erupted in Haifa for those evacuees that are still in hotels in Haifa for 7 months now, and they're demanding action from the Israeli government against Hezbollah because they want to go back to their homes, but safely from any Hezbollah attacks against them.
It certainly looks like returning to those homes is a long way off right now. Balir, talk us through Israel strikes in Baalbek in Lebanon, of course, a stronghold of the terror group, and the activities in southern Lebanon. Bring us up to speed there.
Yes, the last update from the Israeli military and also from the sources in Lebanon talking about 10 strikes in southern Lebanon. We're talking about a range of villages, Ita Sha'bi, Kfar Kila, Rosh Hanikra, Ras al-Nakhura, which is the the Arabic or the Lebanese side of Rosh Hanikra. So lots of places that were hit, and Hezbollah has announced already the killing of 2 of its members. So we're talking that the total number of the members that were killed since October 8th is surpassing right now the 300. But yet this is not deterring Hezbollah from continuing the actions against Israel. Not even the attacks that were yesterday, the largest apparently against Baalbek, the Hezbollah stronghold. There were reports of 15 targets that were hit, specifically targeting very strategic systems that belong to Hezbollah there. But again, this is not changing the equation for Hezbollah. They're still hitting back even after those massive attacks against the Israeli against their targets in Lebanon. So apparently Israel needs to take a different path right now in order to change the whole situation here in the north, and that's exactly what the people that evacuated from the north are demanding right now.
A different path indeed. Correspondent Balir Sladin, live from northern Israel. Thank you so much for that update. And still in studio, Ambassador, I've got 30 seconds until the break. S-5 missiles from Hezbollah, a new weapon, just what Israel needed right now.
Yeah, well, evidently the drones is something that Israel has no good answer for. You know, this is very low flying from very short range, and this is something that I know the military is trying to find solutions, technical solutions. But at the end of the day, we are really heading into this junction. Is it going to be a political settlement or a full-blown war where the IDF will have to take on Hezbollah?
That certainly is the question on everyone's minds, especially people living so close to that border, evacuees waiting to find out when they can go back home. It certainly is a way off. Gentlemen, stay with us. More to discuss. A quick break right now, though. Our coverage continues on this breaking news edition in just 2 moments. Stay tuned. Back in a bit.
The I-24 News Channel, broadcasting from Israel, with dozens of correspondents throughout the world, brings the truth from Israel to hundreds of millions of people in scores of countries.
Completely gunned down in their beds. De la frontière qui sépare Israël.
The state of emergency and war in Israel. Bringing Israel's story to the world. I-24 News Channels. Now on Hot.
Our breaking news coverage continues. I'm Benita Levine. Turning to the Netherlands now. South Africa has today asked the top UN court to order a halt to Israel's offensive in Rafah as part of its case in The Hague, accusing Israel of genocide in the Gaza Strip. It says the Palestinian people face ongoing annihilation. Israel has made it clear it needs to eliminate the Hamas terror threat from Rafah, so what happened on the 7th of October in southern Israel can never happen again. The hearings at the International Court of Justice, also known as the World Court, come after South Africa last week asked for additional emergency measures to protect Rafah. More than 1 million Palestinians have been sheltering there, as we've been discussing here in studio. Now, South Africa wants that court to instruct Israel to stop its entire military campaign in Gaza and not just Rafah, as it had originally requested. No mention of the hostages being held there by terror groups. Take a listen.
Israel's genocide has continued apace and has just reached a new and horrific stage. Israel has sought to hide its crimes through the weaponization of international humanitarian law. It pretends that the civilians it ruthlessly kills through its 2,000-pound bombs, through its targeted airstrikes, through its artificial intelligence systems, through its executions, are human shields. This whitewashing of Israel's genocide misses the key and fundamental element, that of the massive and still mounting evidence of Israel's genocidal intent.
The key point today is that Israel's declared aim of wiping Gaza from the map is about to be realized. Further, evidence of appalling crimes and atrocities is literally being destroyed and bulldozed, in effect wiping the slate clean for those who've committed these crimes and making a mockery of justice.
UN agencies estimate in total that approximately 20% of Gaza's population have been displaced yet again in the past week alone. By 10 May, an estimated 110,000 people had fled Rafah. By yesterday, 15 May, this number had increased to around 600,000, according to the UN. And all the while, and now by these actions, Israel's genocide of Palestinians continues.
So for more, we now go live to the Netherlands. Contributor Alex Kadje is at The Hague. Alex, good to see you. So South Africa laying out its case. No mention of the hostages held in captivity by Hamas for 223 days, the civilians abducted from their homes. And South Africa, of course, needs to prove intent when it comes to accusing Israel of genocide. So talk us through what happened in The Hague today.
Well, certainly that proof of intent will be needed for the broader case, but what happened today was an additional provisional measure, which is the measures put in place while we wait for the court to reach a verdict on the broader case, something that would take a few years, perhaps. Now, the provisional measure today was specifically aimed at Israel's military operation in Rafah. South Africa asking the court to order Israel to cease all military operations in Rafah because they argue that the military operations create conditions in which sustaining human life is impossible and therefore could lead to the total elimination of the Palestinian people in Gaza. There is another request by South Africa, which is to order Israel to allow the free flow of humanitarian aid, full access to all UN agencies to Gaza, as well as observers and journalists, pointing out that Israel's military operation in Rafah has crippled, at least as they described it, the Rafah crossing from allowing humanitarian aid to go in. No mention, however, of the Kerem Shalom being closed because of Hamas rockets. So clearly, South Africa putting that strong case forward, putting a case and the emotional case highlighting the plight of civilians in Gaza, trying to convince the ICJ, that court behind me, to order Israel to cease all military operations in Rafah. This has been South Africa's day in court, making their case, putting that case forward, and tomorrow we'll hear Israel's defense.
And of course, as you say, Israel gets to respond on Friday, and it has, of course, repeatedly dismissed the genocide accusations as outrageous, saying it does what it can to protect civilians in Gaza, and accuses Hamas of using Palestinians as human shields. Of course, Hamas denies that accusation. But talk us through the process next. South Africa wants the court to instruct Israel to stop its entire campaign in Gaza. What happens if it does come to that? Does Israel need to abide by any order from the World Court?
Well, just before that, we'll have Israel's defense, of course, which you rightly mentioned. We've already heard a government spokesperson today saying that South Africa is behaving like the legal arm of Hamas and arguing that this process, these repeated requests for provisional orders, are a waste of the International Court of Justice's time and that Israel always complies with international law. We can expect to hear more of that tomorrow. Now, what happens after that, maybe a couple of weeks before we hear a decision on these orders by the ICJ, the wheels of international justice turn quite slowly. The crucial question, if the court finds against Israel, orders Israel to cease all military operations in Rafah, then Israel is a signatory to this court and will have to abide by that, legally speaking. However, enforcement of these orders is down to the UN Security Council. in that, you could see perhaps a US veto stopping enforcement action against Israel. So once we've heard the Israeli defense and the court has made its decision, that relationship between the Israeli government and the Biden administration will be crucial to see if the US backs Israel diplomatically in the coming weeks.
Certainly, the world will be watching. Thank you so much, contributor Alex Kadja, updating us there live from The Hague in Netherlands. And from the Netherlands to New York, the UN Security Council is set to hold its first meeting since the 7th of October that will focus solely on the hostages held by Hamas terrorists in Gaza for the past 223 days, hostages who were abducted from their homes, from a music festival, and from bases in southern Israel more than 7 months ago. The meeting is titled Condemning Hostage-Taking in Israel on the 7th of October as a Psychological Tool of Terrorism, and it starts in over an hour from now. So, for more, we cross to our senior US correspondent, Mike Wagenheim. He joins us from New York. And Mike, we didn't hear much about the plight of the hostages and their fate at The Hague in recent hours, but it's squarely in focus at this upcoming meeting. What's taken the UN Security Council so long to put the spotlight on the hostages, and what is expected in this meeting?
Benita, Israeli ambassador to the United Nations Gilad Erdan has been pushing for this meeting for quite some time. He's called out the Security Council and the UN at large for failing to put any substantive focus on the release of the hostages and focusing all of their energies and all of their, at times, cynicism on the plight of the Palestinians there in Gaza. So this meeting finally coming around, and what took so long? Well, I-24 News has learned that as much of a proponent of this pushing forward this meeting as the U.S. ambassador to the UN, Linda Thomas-Greenfield, has been, Washington has been held back from giving the thumbs up because they were afraid a meeting of this content would disturb the delicate ongoing negotiations for a ceasefire and a release of those hostages that have been brokered by outside entities like Egypt, Qatar, and the like. However, at this point in time, the undertone has been that the negotiations have not really borne fruit. They're not really going anywhere in the short term. Hence, we see the Biden administration finally giving their green light for this meeting to take place today. What do we expect? Well, a number of countries have co-sponsored the event, including some late additions from the Security Council. France and the United Kingdom were on the original list of co-sponsors, but in the last 24 hours or so, Ecuador has joined on, Japan, Korea, Malta, starting to see now some more, not consensus from the Security Council that this meeting should be held to focus exclusively on the hostages, but at least some more names coming around. It's going to focus not only on trying to get the hostages released, but also in the meantime, before then, getting proof of life, getting access to the hostages for their families, making sure that they can get the medicines and the pharmaceuticals that have long been denied to them. And also in the longer term vision, trying to figure out how the Security Council and the UN can work to avoid these hostage crises in the future. We'll hear from an Israeli expert on the subject. She'll give a briefing. Notably, in the audience today will be an abductee who has since been released, an Israeli woman, and also the mother of a man who was killed on October 7th and whose body was abducted by UNRWA staff. That was actually caught on video, though the UN continues to either deny knowledge of that or at least say that it's questionable. Also today, within that meeting as well, we were supposed to hear from Pramila Patten, the UN's special envoy for sexual violence in conflict, as sexual violence against the hostages will be another topic that will be brought to bear today. However, Patten has since backed out of briefing those participating in the meeting today. Her office refuses to say why. However, a diplomatic source has indicated to I-24 News that she was pressured to do so by someone with quote-unquote sway. And it was suggested that that might have come from her boss, UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres, for two reasons, specifically. One, because she doesn't want to be seen as giving credence to the U.S. and Israeli side of the matter. And secondly, because she was told that the hostage issue at large is outside of her purview, even though sexual violence within the context of the hostage situation certainly is. Patten was the one that wrote the report on sexual violence committed on October 7th and in the aftermath against the hostages held in Gaza. The UN Secretary General's office refused to provide comment to I-24 News, instead directing us to Patten's office, which has also refused to comment on her withdrawal from that meeting.
Staggering indeed. Thank you so much. Great coverage as always. Senior U.S. correspondent Mike Wagenheim, live from New York. Thank you, Mike. And in studio, our panel has been watching and listening to all these developments. Ambassador, I want to come to you, not only about what we just heard from Mike and what is going to happen this long-awaited meeting at the UN Security Council, but first, your thoughts on what we heard out of The Hague earlier on in this broadcast.
Well, I think South Africa has embarrassed itself to become really a stooge of Hamas, a stooge of Iran, basically, and it's quite well known and documented that South Africa, which is in quite a political or economic crisis, needs a lot of money, which gets from Iran. So what they're doing is quite, I would say, outrageous. South Africa has nothing to do with this conflict. They are thousands of miles away, so for them to be able to describe things that they know nothing about, that they hear maybe second or third hand, it's not very credible. However, we know that the international community, unfortunately, is not a friendly platform for Israel, so the outcome can go any way that the judges will decide. We will see tomorrow. I think that the Israeli team, the legal team, will have a very cogent arguments, but this is not really the point. The point is what will, persuade the judges and what political, let's say, influence they would be brought to bear upon them. Also, something which is not very fair is that the Israeli team got only a 2 days notice to make their arguments, which is in such a case is just seconds before you go into a test. Even though Israel opted to go in to, we have a lot that we can say. We should be very proud of what we have done, that no other military in the world would have done a better job than Israel in terms of giving humanitarian aid, in terms of trying to avoid as much as possible peripheral damage and killing of civilians. And you see the ratios. The ratios are, as much as it's difficult to discuss, but if you look at the operations of allied forces, American and others in Afghanistan and Iraq, the ratio was about 10 or 12 civilians killed for every terrorist killed. In Israel is half as much or even a third as much. So it'll be interesting to listen tomorrow to the case, but one thing is certain, the judges in Hague will not determine whether Israel stops the war or not. Mike said correctly that actually they don't have an enforcement capabilities. It's also only the Security Council, and there I believe the UN will veto any attempt, if there is one, to put any sanctions on Israel.
It still seems unconscionable to hear the accusation being leveled against Israel of genocide when Hamas leaders are repeatedly appearing on television saying what happened on the 7th of October, the massacre, they will try and carry it out again and again and again. From a military perspective, Relak, your thoughts on exactly that. If the World Court were to order Israel to stop its operation, how would it impact the war? Your thoughts?
Well, obviously, this is a public relations stunt. This is quite obvious. That's where it's directed, and it coincides with the efforts in universities all over Europe and the United States. And it also coincides with some of Israel's political right, who are supplying munition to those who are attacking Israel by saying that we should conquer Gaza, we should settle Jews in Gaza or Israelis in Gaza, and this actually, and the Prime Minister is not doing anything about this. It also coincides with some activities in the West Bank, which were unchecked. It coincides with some Israeli groups who tried to stop aid going into Gaza yesterday and the day before. So we're in a tough position, and we can discuss this later and how to come out of this.
Something we certainly will be doing. Stay with us, much more to discuss, not least of which is the fact that the hostages never cracked a mention at all in The Hague earlier on in the day. Gentlemen, stay with us, because the war here in the Middle East is set to dominate the 33rd Arab League Summit, which kicks off in Bahrain. Arab leaders from 22 states and UN Secretary-General Antonio Guterres are meeting to discuss regional affairs. Our Emmanuel Anorat has more in this report.
Stuck between a rock and a hard place, Bahrain is the latest country to host the Arab Summit. The Bahraini king opened the summit in the capital Manama with the promise of hope for the region. He didn't miss the opportunity to call for the creation of a Palestinian state in his speech addressing his regional counterparts.
We call for an international peace in the Middle East, for support for full recognition of the Palestinian state and the acceptance of its membership in the United Nations.
Bahrain has been walking a political tightrope as it tries to balance the public outrage at the war in Gaza with a delicate alliance with Israel as part of the Abraham Accords, which came about in 2020. With all eyes on Saudi Arabia as the country looks to normalize ties with Israel through a U.S. brokered deal, Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman reiterated the country's position on Israel's war in Gaza.
We reassure the continuation of the joint work to confront the brutal aggression against our brothers in Palestine and the need for the international community to fulfill for an immediate cessation of the aggression by the occupation forces and to provide humanitarian aid. We also reiterate the necessity to find a fair and comprehensive solution to the Palestinian issue based on the International Legitimacy Resolution and the Arab Peace Initiative that will guarantee the Palestinians the right to establish their independent state.
And we interrupt because IDF spokesperson Daniel Hagari is about to deliver a briefing. Let's go live to Tel Aviv.
Who fell during the battle in Jabalia. First investigation shows that our forces have fired from a tank toward a building where these combat fighters were. This was a wrong identification, a terrible tragedy. It is a tight, packed fighting area where terrorists launch dozens of RPG rockets towards IDF tanks and warriors, and the area is very filled with tension, operational, dense area. We are still in the midst of the investigation. We will learn the lessons from it. We want to maintain the safety of our forces. It is one of our main issues in missions, and we are doing everything in our power to achieve that. I would like to send from here, on behalf of all IDF commanders, condolences to the bereaved families. We share your pain, and each and every one of those who have fallen is a world unto himself. We ache the loss, and we will continue to support you. The IDF is continuing with intense war and fighting in 3 areas in the Gaza Strip, where 3 divisions are fighting Hamas. The forces are fighting in areas where we have identified Hamas activity and in areas where we have yet to operate. These are very tight areas where Hamas terrorists are above ground and below ground, and we must act against them. The 98th Division continues to fight in Jabalia. The forces are killing terrorists, some of whom are being held captive alive. Dozens of rocket launchers have also been hit, and we do not forget the rocket fire towards the city of Sderot in recent days, and we continue to take action against any rocket firing from the Gaza Strip and against any intelligence identification we know of where there are rockets, whether from the air or from the ground. In the southern Gaza Strip, in eastern Rafah, the commando unit has joined the fighting under Division 162. The commando unit specializes in special ways of locating shafts, and we destroy them. We continue to destroy Hamas infrastructure, terror infrastructure. We find weapons and we kill terrorists. At the same time as these efforts of offense are taking place, we are also strengthening the political echelon in order to strengthen the humanitarian aid. And so in the next few days, the floating pier will start to operate, led by the US and in coordination with the IDF. This pier will allow humanitarian aid to be brought in from the sea, and it adds to other efforts to have humanitarian aid brought in from the ground. Today, we brought in about 350 humanitarian aid in trucks, 350 trucks. And in the northern border, we have attacked tonight an area where weapons are manufactured and stored, which belongs to the missile precision project of Hezbollah in Jabal Shams. This attack was carried out in response to Hezbollah's fire and attack, which has hit a balloon of the IDF as part of its operational missions. We continue to maintain the capacity to hold an aerial vision, and we also attack Hezbollah buildings and the threat they pose on our border. It is important that Israeli citizens know that the Israeli Air Force intercepts once every few days unmanned aerial vehicles that come in not only from Lebanon, but from Syria, from Iraq, from Yemen, and on all Israeli borders. Over the last 24 hours, we have attacked targets in southern Lebanon, and we have killed a squad of Hezbollah that are in charge of the UAV unit and were on their way to carry out a terror attack. Over the last 24 hours, rockets have been launched from Lebanon by Hezbollah to Israel, and also an armed UAV blew up around Metula, and one of our IDF combat troops was injured, severely injured. Two more were moderately injured, and their families were updated. In Judea and Samaria, a terrorist stabbed an IDF officer, and after 3 hours, the IDF and ISA forces have captured the terrorist and have begun to question him, to interrogate him. Representatives of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs have spoken to workers from Thailand who were in Be'eri and were killed on October 7th. Their families have been notified. Their bodies have been abducted and are currently being held captive in Gaza by Hamas. On October 7th, Hamas terrorists killed brutally 39 Thai men and women and abducted 31 to Gaza. Like them, many other foreign people were abducted from Nepal, from the United States, and other countries. The brutality of Hamas was directed at many. It didn't matter to them which country they came from. I mean, before our very eyes, we see the moral duty to help everyone return, so that all 132 hostages return home as swiftly as possible. We will continue to fight. We will continue to take action together with all the security organizations in order to create the conditions that will help them return home to their families, whether they live here in Israel or overseas. Any questions? Rav Borovich from Cannes. First question, will the North continue to burn until the war in the Gaza Strip ends? And the second question is, does the IDF also think that, first of all, we must eliminate Hamas until the last terrorist, until the last combatant, and only then to have another regime to rule the area? The war that we are fighting is multi-frontal. It is on numerous fronts at the same time, and I told you what happened just the last 24 hours in Gaza, in the north, in the central command, within our borders, aerial threats that are just being posed every single day. We have great challenges before us, but we are ready for them. In the north, Israeli citizens, residents of the north, are living in impossible situations, and those who have been evacuated are waiting for us to create the right security conditions, a different one to the one we have now, so that they will be able to live safely by the fence in their homes, and we are determined to make that happen. At this stage, we are fighting Hezbollah, and we are responding in an intense way to all their actions and all their acts of terror, and we will continue to do that. As for the fighting in Gaza, we continue to break Hamas apart in places where Hamas is trying to put itself back together again. We will continue to break it down, take it apart. In some places, we anticipated that it would try to put itself back together again. We see it in Jabalia, and we're acting against it. In Rafah, these are still areas we have not been in, and that's why we need to take action there. We need to dismantle the Hamas battalions there. Also, in addition to everything I've said and everything that's been said in the context of how we need to look at Gaza, moving ahead as part of the fighting and to look at the victory snapshot, this is a question that needs to be answered by the political echelon. Thank you very much and good evening.
IDF spokesperson Daniel Hagari delivering his briefing, day 223 of the war. I've got 20 seconds. Relek Shafir, is Israel in control? Is it handling what's happening? Very briefly.
We're in control in Gaza. We're fighting. It's tough. It'll take time. Let's hope that the Israeli government can make friends rather than alienate itself from friends in order to support this campaign.
Brigadier General in the Reserve.